Okay, let's try this again. The original video that I did for the chapter 6 annotations messed up. I have no idea what happened, so we're going to do this again. Once again, I am going to be reading from the online PDF version, so I won't be referring to page numbers. The three things that you're annotating for in chapter 6: one, diction. So I want you to pay attention to the word choice in this chapter that conveys the mood or moods. The second thing, before you get started reading, I want you to make some predictions, right? So the plot outcome. What predictions did you make that were accurate? And what predictions did you make that were not accurate? So I want you to write those down in the front of this chapter. And then as we go along, you can see were you correct or not. The third thing that I want you to look for is the structure of the chapter and comparing it to other chapters in the text. So, what is the purpose of how this chapter is structured? And when I say structured, I'm not referring to the sequence of events. I don't want to know what happened first, what happened second, third, and so on. I want to know how did he structure this ending chapter for the text. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be in, again, chapter 6. Okay. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gabilan Mountains, and the hilltops were rosy in the sun. But by the pool among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of the motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent head and beak glanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides, the brown, dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet, and row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up by the pool's green surface. As quickly as it had come, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. What are some words that you notice in this introduction in chapter 6? Some words that stand out to you that develop the mood in the beginning. Okay. I know some of the words that stand out to me. One, you should notice a similarity in what I just read and something that we have read previous in this text as well. But one word that sticks out to me is head, right? We have, we have the silent head. We have, um, the water snake tilting its head from side to side. And we have that twice. So I noticed that repetition there and the significance. We have the word green. That's repeated, the green pool. And again, let's see, was it green as well? No, I just saw green and it just left me. Oh yeah, and the pool's green surface. Okay, so we have those two things. So I would look at what is the mood and what words does Steinbeck use to create that mood. Okay, let's continue. Suddenly, Lenny appeared out of the brush, and he came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked itself clear of the water, and flew off downriver. The little snake slid in among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. When a little bird skittered over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up and he strained toward the sound with eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he dropped his head and drank again. When he was finished, he sat down on the bank, with his side to the pool, so that he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed on out of the valley, and as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with increasing brightness. Lenny said softly, "I didn't forget. You bet. Gosh darn. Hide in the brush and wait for George." He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "George gonna give me hell," he said. George gonna wish he was alone and not have me bothering him." He turned his head and looked at the bright mountain tops. "I can go right off there and find a cave," he said. And he continued sadly, "and never have no ketchup, but I won't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away." And then from out of Lenny's head there came a little fat old woman. She wore thick bull's-eye glasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets, and she was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was in Lenny's voice. "I told you and told you," she said. "I told you. Mind George, 'cause he's such a nice fella and good to you. But you don't never take no care. You do bad things." And Lenny answered her, "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and tried. I couldn't help it." "You never give a thought to George," she went on in Lenny's voice. "He been doing nice things for you all the time. When he got a piece of pie, you always got half or more'n half, and if they was any ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you." "I know," said Lenny miserably. "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and tried." She interrupted him. "All the time he could 'a' had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would 'a' took his pay and raised hell, and he could 'a' set in a pool room and played snooker, but he got to take care of you." Lenny moaned with grief. "I know, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I'll go right off in the hills, and I'll find a cave, and I'll live there so I won't be no more trouble to George." "You just say that," she said sharply. "You're always saying that, and you know, son of a gun and well, you ain't never going to do it. You'll just stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time." Lenny said, "I might just as well go away. George ain't going to let me tend no rabbits now." Aunt Clara was gone, and from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on its haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears and crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke in Lenny's voice too. "Tend rabbits," it said scornfully. "You crazy guy, you ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit. You'd forget 'em and let 'em go hungry. That's what you'd do, and then what would George think?" "I would not forget," Lenny said loudly. "The hell you wouldn't," said the rabbit. "You ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram you into hell. Goodness knows George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but it don't do no good. If you think George gonna let you tend rabbits, you're even crazier'n usual. He ain't. He's gonna beat hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's gonna do." Now Lenny retorted belligerently. "He ain't neither. George won't do nothing like that. I've knew George since I forget when, and he ain't never raised his hand to me with a stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean." "Well, he's sick of you," said the rabbit. "He's gonna beat hell out of you and then go away and leave you." "He won't!" Lenny cried frantically. "He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travels together." Okay, let's talk about this scene right here with George and Aunt Clara and now the rabbit. How do we see Lenny's conflict playing out in this scene right here, and why do you think that Steinbeck is portraying this conflict from the Aunt Clara's perspective, and then also from the rabbit having a conversation with him? Okay, all right. But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, "He gonna leave you, you crazy guy. He gonna leave you all alone. He gonna leave you, crazy guy." Lenny put his hands over his ears. "He ain't! I tell you he ain't!" And he cried, "Oh, George! George! George!" George came quietly out of the brush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain. George said quietly, "What the hell you yelling about?" Lenny got up on his knees. "You ain't never gonna leave me, are you, George? I know you ain't." George came stiffly near and sat down beside him. "No." "I knowed it," Lenny cried. "You ain't that kind." George was silent. Lenny said, "George, yeah, I done another bad thing." "It don't make no difference," George said, and he fell silent again. Only the topmost ridges were in the sun now. The shadow in the valley was blue and soft. From the distance came the sound of men shouting to one another. George turned his head and listened to the shouts. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. So once again, we have these conversations, and then Steinbeck stops to give us a short, detailed description about the scene around them, referring to where they are, what time of day it is. So I want you to look at the words in this one. It says, only the topmost ridges were in the sun now. The shadow in the valley was blue and soft. How do you think the words blue and soft contribute to the mood right here in this part of the chapter? Think about that. Make some annotations. Then I'm going to pick up with Lenny said. Lenny said, George, yeah, ain't you going to give me hell? Give you hell? Sure, like you always done before. Like if I didn't have you, I'd take my $50. Oh man, Lenny, you can't remember nothing that happens, but you remember every word I say. Well, ain't you going to say it? George shook himself. He said woodenly, if I was alone, I could live so easy. His voice was monotonous, had no emphasis. I could get a job and not have no mess. He stopped. Go on, said Lenny, and when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go to a cat house. He stopped again. Lenny looked eagerly at him. Go on, George. Ain't you going to give me no more hell? No, said George. Well, I can go away, said Lenny. I'll go right off in the hills and find a cave if you don't want me. George shook himself again. No, he said. I want you to stay with me here. Lenny said craftily, tell me like you done before. Tell you what? About the other guys and about us. George said, guys like us got no family. They make a little stake and then they blow it in. They ain't got nobody in the world that gives a hoot in hell about 'em. But not us, Lenny cried happily. Tell about us now. George was quiet for a moment. But not us, he said, because I got you and I got you. We got each other, that's what. That gives a hoot in hell about us, Lenny cried in triumph. The little evening breeze blew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled and the wind waves flowed up the green pool. And the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before. George took off his hat. He said shakily, take off your hat, Lenny. The air feels fine. Lenny removed his hat dutifully and laid it on the ground in front of him. The shadow in the valley was bluer, and the evening came fast. On the wind, the sound of crashing in the brush came to them. Lenny said, tell how it's going to be. George had been listening to the distant sounds. For a moment, he was businesslike. Look across the river, Lenny, and I'll tell you so you can almost see it. And what do you think is going to happen here? What are some of the predictions that you made? Lenny turned his head and looked off across the pool and up the darkening slopes of the Gabilons. We're going to get a little place, George began. He reached in his side pocket and brought out Carlson's Luger. He snapped off the safety, and the hand and gun lay on the ground behind Lenny's back. He looked at the back of Lenny's head, at the place where the spine and skull were joined. I want you to look, I'm going to stop right there. I want you to look at this first sentence and look at the diction there, okay, and what's different about it from before. A man's voice called from up the river, and another man answered. Go on, said Lenny. George raised the gun and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again. Go on, said Lenny. How's it going to be? We going to get a little place? We'll have a cow, said George, and we'll have maybe a pig and chickens, and down the flat we'll have a little piece alfalfa. For the rabbits, Lenny shouted. For the rabbits, George repeated. And I get to tend the rabbits, and you get to tend the rabbits. Lenny giggled with happiness. And live on the fat of the land. Yes. Lenny turned his head. No, Lenny, look down there across the river, like you can almost see the place. Lenny obeyed him. George looked down at the gun. There were crashing footsteps in the brush now. George turned and looked toward them. Go on, George. When are we going to do it? Going to do it soon. Me and you. You and me. Everybody going to be nice to you. Ain't going to be no more trouble. Nobody going to hurt nobody nor steal from 'em. I want you to think about this reference in this and how it's a foreshadowing. Okay? I'm going to pick back up. No, said George. No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I never been mad, and I ain't now. That's the thing I want you to know. The voices came close now. George raised the gun and listened to the voices. Lenny begged, "Let's do it now. Let's get that place now." "Sure, right now. I gotta. We gotta." And George raised the gun and steadied it, and he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. Lenny jarred and then settled slowly forward to the sand, and he lay without quivering. I want you to look at those specific word, rolled, where it says the crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. And think about why that word was chosen in this event. George shivered and looked at the gun, and then he threw it from him back up on the bank near the pile of old ashes. The brush seemed filled with the cries and the sound of running feet. Slim's voice shouted, "George! Where are you at, George?" But George sat stiffly on the bank and looked at his right hand that had thrown the gun away. The group burst into the clearing, and Curly was ahead. He saw Lenny lying on the sand. "Got him, by gosh!" He went over and looked down at Lenny, and then he looked back at George. "Right in the back of the head," he said softly. Slim came directly to George and sat down beside him, sat very close to him. "Never you mind," said Slim. "A guy got to sometimes." But Carlson was standing over George. "How'd you do it?" he asked. "I just done it," George said tiredly. "Did he have my gun?" "Yeah, he had your gun." "And you got it away from him, and you took it and you killed him?" "Yeah, that's how." George's voice was almost a whisper. He looked steadily at his right hand that had held the gun. Slim twitched George's elbow. "Come on, George. Me and you'll go in and get a drink." George let himself be helped to his feet. "Yeah, a drink." Slim said, "You hadda, George. I swear you hadda. Come on with me." He led George into the entrance of the trail and up toward the highway. Curly and Carlson looked after them, and Carlson said, "Now what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys?" And that is the end. So if we look at this ending, especially here, once the other guys get in and meet George and see Lenny, right? Look at the different reactions that they have. One, Slim's reaction, Curly's reaction, and then Carlson and the other guy's reaction. And then the very ending, right? We see Slim telling George, you had to, you had to. And then it says he led George into the entrance of the trail and up toward the highway. So I want you to think about this ending here. Okay. Think about where we started, where we ended. Okay. And then I also want you to think about Curly and Carlson, and their final reaction, right? The final line in Of Mice and Men. And what is your take on that?